Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show. Hong Kong Confidential is brought to you by Teresa's Turkish Towels. Teresa imports the finest 100% Turkish cotton towels that dry very quickly, making them perfect for Hong Kong's humid climate. Say goodbye to the traditional smelly and stinky towels and try the colourful and fresh selections available online or in Teresa's Wan Chai store. Use the promo code CONFIDENTIAL online or mention this podcast when you visit in person to receive $100 off your entire order when you order 2 or more towels. With 100% satisfaction guaranteed or your money back, the only thing you've got to lose are the musty smells that permeate traditional terry towels. Visit www.hkturkish.com in order to get the address and directions to Teresa's semi-hidden location. Today I'm here with Dr. Andy Cornish from the World Wildlife Fund. Thanks for meeting me today, Andy. How are you?
Pleasure, Jules. Good to see you again.
Andy, can you tell me a little bit about what you do at the World Wildlife Fund?
I run a program called Sharks Restoring the Balance, which is a collaboration between WWF and Traffic, which is the Wildlife Trade Monitoring Organization, and that is basically a global program to conserve sharks and rays.
Have you been traveling lately to work on that program?
Yes, I've been traveling a lot recently. I've just got back from 2 weeks in Indonesia and then another week in Singapore. The week in Indonesia was to take part in a shark symposium, which was very, very interesting. But I also got the opportunity to visit a remote fishing village in East Flores, where Indonesia is partnering with the community to test an electronic device that will hopefully repel sharks and stop them being caught in gill nets. So that's pretty cutting edge.
Oh, so they're going to put this device on the nets and then that will send the sharks away.
Yeah, so sharks are sensitive to electric fields. And it's not a new idea in itself, the idea that you could actually repel sharks with an electric field that they're particularly sensitive to. But it's rarely been trialed for use of actually keeping sharks out of specific fishing gear. It's at a fairly early stage at the moment, and the units are quite bulky, but it was a great place to test it because there are a lot of sharks there, and unlike many places, the fishermen don't actually want to catch sharks. They've got a problem with sharks actually breaking holes in the nets.
Why would some people catch sharks and some don't want to catch sharks? Is it just simply for the shark fin soup that people want to catch sharks, or also for the shark meat, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. 5 years ago, I think most people would have been saying that demand for shark fins in Asia was the major driver of overfishing of sharks. But since the mid-1990s, we've seen a doubling in the international trade of shark meat. And it's pretty clear from my travels, at least, that in certain parts of the world, people would continue fishing sharks for their meat, even if there was no market for the fins.
Is the shark meat known as flake?
It is in places like Australia, yes.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I have seen it being sold.
Yeah, it's places like the UK. It used to be sold as rock salmon.
Oh, really?
That's right.
Funny name.
You get all these interesting trade names there that people use when they don't necessarily want people to know exactly what the species is. Orange roughy is another classic of that. So,
oh, is it as well?
The original name for orange roughies is something slimehead.
What?
You try marketing something called a slimehead.
And we're having slimehead for dinner. Get in here.
No, give me the veg.
Andy, what's the situation with shark finning in Asia at the moment? What's happening? Is it becoming less? Are people becoming more aware? Are restaurants having less shark fin on the menu?
Well, there's two different issues. So shark finning is defined as actually catching the animal, cutting the fins off and discarding the carcass at sea. That is becoming less prevalent because more and more countries are putting in place regulations that say that you have to bring the whole shark back to shore if you catch it, which is great. In terms of shark fin consumption, WWF has been leading a regional campaign focused particularly on hotels and restaurants to reduce the demand of shark fin, particularly in Hong Kong, Singapore, Jakarta, and 2 cities in Malaysia. And we're pretty confident that we have achieved our goal of reducing consumption by 10%, at least in those markets. And some really good work done by WildAid and others in mainland China saw the government there ban consumption of shark fin by mainland officials at all kind of official banquets back in, I think it was 2012.
That's quite big, isn't it?
That was massive, yeah. I mean, Hong Kong and Singapore, it's definitely weddings where most shark fin is consumed. Those kind of consumer surveys that shown were never done in China prior to that ban on officials consuming shark fin. But it seems from the figures that in places like Beijing and Shanghai, that may have been the majority of kind of events that shark fin was being consumed at.
What about big hotel chains and Chinese restaurants and things like that? Are they stopping it?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you mentioned those two kind of sub-segments or whatever you want to call them within the kind of hospitality industry. So the international hotel chains and many hotel chains have responded very well to this. Most of them now have a ban on consuming shark fin. And we added up the numbers last year and 18,000 hotels, so this is individual hotels, have banned shark fin and more than 500 in mainland China.
Wow, that's good.
Yeah,
that's a lot.
That's a great number. And, certainly some of those were in places where they never would have sold shark fin originally, because places like the Hilton, the Holiday Inn and those kind of chains just banned them worldwide. But it's really impressive. And it really just shows that this issue has really gone mainstream.
Which is great. And how has it gone mainstream? Is it through social media education? Is it through education of kids in schools? Is it through marketing? What are the ways that you get the message across to people? I suppose there's all those ways and more.
All those ways and more. I think in Hong Kong, so I actually started working on this when I was in another position, actually 10 years ago, from this very office where we're sat now. And we focused in the early days, we focused on corporate pledges. So even though companies may not be actively buying and selling shark fin themselves, it's very typical in Hong Kong for companies to have a spring dinner where they treat their employees. And certainly back in those days, 10 years ago, those meals those used to include shark fin. Because the corporate sector is well respected within Hong Kong, we started off with this corporate pledge. And then once it was clear that WWF was around and we were going to continue working on this, we then focused, along with other advocacy organizations within Hong Kong, on hotels and restaurants, particularly those ones that were multinational. And it took a number of years, but in 2012, the Peninsula, and then a few months later, Shangri-La, were the first hotel chains to announce a total ban. And, many others have followed suit.
That's brilliant.
In the 6 years since.
Can you tell me why shark fin is so popular? Like, what is it about it that the Chinese people in particular want to have it?
You'd asked me before about the Chinese restaurant sector. So it is mostly weddings within Hong Kong. And unfortunately, that sector has been particularly resistant. So a survey recently done by the Hong Kong Shark Foundation found that 99% of Chinese banqueting restaurants are still selling shark fin. And I think what we've seen is that most of the messaging has been kind of environmental or humanitarian. So don't consume sharks because either we should conserve sharks or because it's cruel or because, we need sharks in the ecosystem and the fishing for them is all unsustainable. I think it seems fairly clear that within somewhere like Hong Kong and Singapore, where this kind of messaging has been going on for many years now, that probably most of the people, and including young people who respond to environmental messages, have probably stopped eating shark fin and made some attempts to persuade other people not to consume. But we have to acknowledge that there's a bunch of hardcore shark fin consumers out there who don't respond to that kind of messaging, and that's something that we need to improve on moving forwards.
And do they consume it because it's a sign of wealth, or is it culturally positive thing for them? What I want to know is what are the reasons why they actually have it? Why is it so important for them to have it at big events and weddings?
Yes, my understanding is if you look at the history, so originally when shark fin was first consumed, it was only consumed by the emperor. And then sometime, it's a bit difficult to nail down, but maybe around the 70s, shark fin consumption, certainly in weddings, other celebrations, became more popular. And it's not clear. I mean, people have talked about and speculated about the kind of rising wealth of the middle class, but it's probably a combination of that and shark fin being much more actively marketed as something that whoever is providing the banquet should be providing, kind of to show their status in society, to show respect to their guests. Some of this is interesting. Some of the consumer surveys that have been done show that those kind of reasons are actually more important than taste.
I've heard it. I've never had it, of course, but I've heard it doesn't really taste of anything. Isn't it just like watery, a bit like dishwater?
I have had it, and I've actually had it quite a few times when I was a child growing up in Hong Kong and actually invited to weddings. So yes, the shark fin may not taste of anything, but it's always served in a broth. So I always remember having it in kind of a chicken soup, and it was a bit like having a chicken noodle soup. I mean, you've got these kind of crunchy, almost noodle-like filaments within the soup. So, I mean, it can taste quite tasty, but that's just because of the soup. But I think, Westerners saying, well, people shouldn't consume it because it doesn't have any taste is totally missing the point. And the fact that it's may not have little nutritional value is not really the point either.
No, it's about shark conservation, isn't it?
Well, it's almost, and you have to remember as well, like, particularly for weddings, and this is the way it's been described to me, is that, rather than give gifts, people typically give money. And in return, they get the banquet. So, if you're somebody who wants to have shark fin and you've made your donation to the couple, some of these people are quite disappointed if they don't get their shark fins. Traditionally, if you're engaged with traditional, and this is a southern Chinese practice, it's not all of China.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it's really Hong Kong, Fujian, Guangzhou, this kind of southern area where it originated from and is really the kind of heart of it. In a traditional wedding, I've described it, if you go to there and there isn't shark fin, some people would see it like sitting down for a Western meal and having no knife or fork. It's so integral.
Right. Can it be insulting to the guests if it's not there?
It can certainly cause friction.
Right. Oh, okay. That's so interesting.
Between the elder generation and whoever it is that's done the ordering.
And that's why it's so prevalent still in weddings, for that exact reason.
Yeah, that's right. And I think what I call the kind of social dynamics of Chinese dining, where one person will order for everybody without consulting them, rather than a typical Western where people might indicate what dishes you want. That kind of dynamic leads itself also to people. If they're not sure whether people want to consume shark fin, they'll order it anyway.
Yes, exactly. So, Andy, where did your interest in sharks come from?
Firstly, an interest in scuba diving. So I learnt, I suppose, I was about 20 or so traveling in Central America, then came back, did my doctorate on reef fishes. One of the things that was very obvious, this was in Hong Kong, was that the size of fish in Hong Kong generally was very small. If you saw a fish bigger than 30 centimeters, you were doing very well. And sharks have pretty much been exterminated from Hong Kong waters. So if you look, I did a bit of research around the time when we had 3 fatal shark attacks in Hong Kong back in 1995, while I was at the University of Hong Kong, and did some research with my PhD supervisor on history of shark attacks in Hong Kong. And there's cases back in World War II where people jumping off ships just to swim in the water in Stanley were actually eaten by sharks, or I should say died from injuries from shark bites. And certainly there's one amazing description from the 1940s that basically says that sharks were everywhere in Hong Kong back in those times, particularly around some of the outer islands. They were year round. But reef sharks that are common in many other countries, whether it's black-tip reef sharks or grey reef sharks, we all used to have these species. These days, if you have one reef shark caught, it makes the headlines. And industrial and other fishing pressure in Hong Kong and this kind of part of southern China is one of the most intense in the world.
And that's why there are such small fish and no sharks, because of overfishing?
That's right. We used to have a very large issue with trawling. Thankfully, we have a trawling ban in place now. It's not going to benefit sharks so much. But anyway, I realized a little bit later on that, there was 1 or 2 species, well, actually only 2 species of sharks that you could still find occasionally. One is a white-spotted bamboo shark, so it only grows to about 1 meter. It kind of lives on the bottom. So I was curious about why that shark was able to survive, whereas pretty much all the rest had just been wiped out. And it turns out it's not really a top predator. It reproduces fairly quickly. And it's just feeding on things like little shrimp and worms and things in the mud. So there's still plenty of that kind of food left for them. And as I say, they reproduce quite quickly, so they're able to withstand fishing pressure a lot more than other species. So that and kind of just an interest in, seeing sharks when I was diving, I suppose, is where it starts.
When you saw your first shark diving, was your heart pounding? Were you nervous, or were you just like, wow, that's amazing?
It's so long ago now, I can't really remember.
Oh, really? That's so funny.
I'm struggling to think that would have been. That would have probably been in Central America, in Honduras, when I learned to dive. I guess I grew up in Hong Kong with an interest in snakes and other things that bite.
Yeah, so you didn't have that level of fear, yeah.
Yeah, so perhaps I was curious rather than
nervous.
And, you soon learn with sharks that the vast majority of places in the world and the vast majority of species, that what they'll do, sharks will like come in and have a quick look at you and then just disappear. And very rare that you see anything other than that. So,
have you ever had an incident diving with a shark where you felt under any sort of threat?
not diving, actually. I worked for a year for the government in American Samoa, and I used to snorkel by myself, which is not recommended.
Not recommended, ladies and gentlemen.
Recommended.
Take a buddy. There's a buddy system.
That's right. It just really wasn't.
You didn't have any friends.
Right. I'll get back to you afterwards.
So you're out snorkeling on your own?
Yes, I was out snorkeling. The visibility was quite good, and there was I used to normally see turtles or reef sharks. I must have got in the way of this reef shark because I saw this reef shark. I was probably only about 1.5 meters, about 8 meters below me. And when it saw me, it came straight up to the surface and did a circle around me. And it actually did the threat display when they kind of arch their back at you. So I knew what that was. And basically
What should one do in that situation?
Well, you've got to keep your eye on the shark.
Yeah.
So I watched it and I moved away from it, basically keeping my fins in between it and me, so that if it was tempted to come and threaten me further, I could either kick it with the fins or, if really necessary. And it lost interest when I moved out the way.
Okay,
Disappeared.
wow. Cool, that's a cool little story. How many species of shark are there?
One of the most amazing things about sharks is the number of species being discovered is going up all the time at a rate about 1 every 2 weeks.
What?
Would you believe it? Yes.
No, so they're still discovering new species of
That's right.
sharks. Wow.
Right, so the figures that I tend to quote are 470 species of sharks and 500 species of ray, but though I know those figures are a few years old now. And if anybody budding marine biologists out there, I mean, there are still a good chance of finding new species. I mean, some of them are really deep water species. Some of them are endemic species that don't occur in places where many people go. But interestingly, some of them are actually just species that look very physically very alike. And it's really kind of DNA and a much closer examination that has revealed that they're probably actually different species.
Oh, that's interesting as well. Can you tell me why is it important that we have shark conservation?
Well, I think there's a number of different reasons for this. I mean, one of which is that sharks evolved around 400 million years ago. They predated the dinosaurs. They've survived the dinosaurs, and they've really been a constant in our oceans. They've been, really important animals, particularly, predatory animals that have regulated ecosystems and had a really important kind of role in ecosystems for that long. And, many of the other fish that we eat today, have evolved much, much more recently. So I think a bit of respect for sharks is one reason. The other reason, which is exaggerated a bit sometimes to extend to all sharks, is that really the large apex predators, tiger sharks, bull sharks, great hammerhead sharks, those kind of sharks really do play a really important role in regulating marine ecosystems and seem to be linked to maintaining the health of coral reefs.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. There was an interesting study done in Australia not so long ago, which looked at reefs that had been fished and basically had few sharks left, and reefs that were fairly well protected or isolated and still had pretty healthy shark populations. And it seemed that those that did have sharks, the corals were actually able to withstand damage better. And it's thought that basically when corals die, they get repopulated by little coral polyps that come out of the plankton. Now, those coral polyps need to land on a clean surface, whether it's rock or whether it's dead coral. And if you don't have herbivorous fish like goatfishes, then the coral will actually get covered in algae, and it's very difficult for the new coral polyps to settle on them. So what seemed to be happening was that if you had healthier shark populations, somehow that meant that you had healthier herbivorous fish, like these goatfishes, and they were cleaning the algae off the surfaces, whether it's dead coral or rock, and that was actually making it easier for new coral polyps to actually come and recolonize the regrowth of corals. So the mechanism is not very clear, but it's pretty clear. The large sharks in particular had that role to play. And actually one really interesting study very recently, just in the last few months, showed that for coral reefs where the sharks had mostly been fished out, fish eyes were getting smaller.
Oh, because they didn't need to keep their eyes out for the sharks.
That's right.
What?
And if I remember right, their tail fin as well was a bit smaller because they didn't need to put so much effort into watching out and avoiding the sharks. So
that's fascinating.
I know, I've never read anything quite like that. And so, sharks are having an impact on their world and the things that they have on, and essentially what we say is that if you remove these sharks, you're basically destabilizing the ecosystem in a way that's hard to predict.
What's the life expectancy of a shark? I guess it varies from species to species, does it?
Varies massively.
What would be the longest that one could live?
Well, there's a great little story in there. It was only revealed a couple of years ago. I mean, something like a whale shark, so the largest fish in the sea, it's thought that they might live up to about 100 years.
Wow.
There's several different ways that you can age sharks. I mean, one of the most common ones is just those sharks that are actually in public aquaria, just see how long they live. And of course, the ones in public aquaria are probably not, subject to predation themselves. You can't really do that with whale sharks because they're such large animals.
But wouldn't they live shorter lives in public aquariums because they're depressed?
They might do. They might do.
Makes sense to me.
I'm not sure I've seen any studies on the depression levels of sharks in aquaria. That'd be a good PhD.
You feel free to study that. And you don't need to credit me.
But let me tell you,
yeah,
the world record holder for the oldest vertebrate in the ocean is a Greenland shark.
Yeah.
Someone discovered just 2 years ago, I think it was, that they can live up to 400 years old.
No.
Yes.
What?
So Greenland sharks live in the polar regions. They're fairly slow moving, but they get quite large. I think 4 meters and upwards. And they're fairly sluggish because of the cold water. Now, one of the ways that people age sharks, and I've actually done this myself with the bamboo sharks, is that in some of the species, their vertebrae will actually put down rings. So if you take a cross section, it's a bit like a tree, and you have to verify it, but often those rings will correspond to 1 year of the animal's life. Now, people tried this with the Greenland shark, but apparently it doesn't work. And the Greenland shark has very kind of soft body parts. But somebody discovered that the proteins in their eye, that some of those proteins, when they're put down, actually don't age. And the original proteins actually remain in the eye. And you can actually use carbon dating techniques to date the age of those proteins. I know it's very...
What?
Yeah, amazing stuff. And they managed to get hold of, I think it was 20 Greenland sharks that had died from one cause or another. They did this aging process. And one of the individuals, a female, they estimated was probably around 400 years old. So
that is so incredible.
that could have been swimming around at the time of Shakespeare.
I know. That is so incredible to think.
Mind-blowing, hey?
I mean, it's got to be the longest living species on Earth. Is there anything that lives longer?
There are trees, there are plants that do.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Animals or mammals?
Animals, well, if you look at something like a coral colony, it's a different kind of organism. The previous record for a vertebrate in the sea was a bowhead whale that they reckoned was between 200 and 250 years old. So this has been that by a long way. But yeah, just incredible.
Oh my God, I want you on my shark trivia team. I tell you what. Andy, how do sharks attack their prey?
Well, it depends on what kind of shark they are.
Let's just go for the big killers.
Given there are hundreds. Well, I mean, let's talk about something like a wobbegong shark first. So,
what a cool name, a wobbegong. What?
well, you've never heard of wobbegongs?
No, but I love it. What a great, it sounds like a town in Australia. I live at Wobbegong, near Woolloomooloo, just down from Wollongong.
Yeah. There's more species of wobbegong, I think, in Australia than anywhere else.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
So that makes sense. They're not particularly widespread.
Was it?
Yeah, they're very kind of flat sharks. They just lie on the bottom. They have all these kind of frills and tassels around their mouth to kind of break up the body shape. They're pretty well camouflaged. They'll just lie on the bottom until something swims past and then ambush it. Whereas something like great white shark, they're quite well known for grey coloration, and they tend to swim underneath places where you might find seals, and they will do a sharp vertical attack coming up to the seal when it's floating on the surface. So they'll kind of...
Oh, and that's why great whites do that to surfers and stuff like that, because they think that it's a seal. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Or a turtle or something like that.
Oh, how interesting.
Yes.
Wow. And do sharks actually cannibalize each other? Do they eat other sharks?
Certainly large sharks eat small sharks.
Yeah.
Different species.
But a great white wouldn't eat a great white.
I actually don't know the answer to that. But what I can tell you is that people found that, so a short fin mako shark, which looks a little bit like a great white shark, but it's the fastest shark out there, that great white shark gives birth to live young. And actually within the womb, one developing shark will actually eat the other ones within the mother.
So then they only give birth to one?
I'm not sure if it's only one, but it's certainly not as many as they started off with.
That's interesting.
So, yeah.
And do you know how fast that fastest shark goes?
The speed that I've seen is about 30 kilometers an hour, but people think that maybe they could get them up to 60 miles an hour.
Wow.
But I think one of the interesting things with short fin mako, and I was actually talking to some school children earlier in the week about this, is actually imagining how would you measure the speed of a shark out there in the open ocean?
Yeah.
It's not like you can go anywhere with short fin makos and typically see a lot. The two ways that people have researchers have actually done it so far is one of which is actually to catch them on a rod, and then when you release them, just see how fast they take the line out.
Right.
And measure that. And the other way, and there's actually some quite amusing videos on YouTube of this, are to get some bait in a box and drag it behind a speedboat with video cameras underwater. And see
if they can keep up.
See how fast you can go.
That's a really good idea.
Well, it is.
Simple.
And it isn't. Yeah, but clearly neither of those are very natural conditions. And there's all kinds of disturbance from the propellers and everything like that.
It's going to slow them down, isn't it? It's going to be a bit of resistance.
Well, I don't know, but I was saying to the school children, if you can think of a better way to do it, there might be a job for you as a marine scientist.
Yeah, brilliant. And are there any animals that actually prey on sharks? Do they have predators?
Yes, killer whales are known to feed on sharks.
Yeah.
For smaller sharks would have many more predators, and certainly in the cold waters off places like Canada, I have not necessarily studied, but I've certainly seen videos of giant octopus attacking and eating small sharks.
What, really?
Yeah.
Wow, that would be cool.
Not if you're the shark, it wouldn't be.
No, but that would be really cool to look at. Are sharks solitary or social animals?
Very dependent on the species.
So some of them move in packs and groups and others individual?
Yeah, very much so. Things like hammerhead sharks, renowned scalloped hammerhead sharks are often found in large schools, and you see those amazing pictures of kind of hundreds of silhouettes in places like the Galapagos, whereas many other sharks would be more solitary.
What percentage of shark species do you believe are endangered?
The IUCN Shark Specialist Group did a landmark study on this in 2014 and concluded that 25% of all the sharks, rays, and their close relatives are threatened with extinction.
Wow, that's huge. And that's purely really due to overfishing.
Yeah, that's right.
What about plastics in the ocean and the way that the rubbish is heading out to seas? Is that having an impact too?
Yeah, overfishing is by far the greatest threat. There are freshwater species of sharks and stingrays in some parts of the world that have additional challenges from dams and habitat modification and things like that. But really, it's overfishing. And for some species like the oceanic white-tip shark, which used to be one of the most common sharks on the open ocean, you might think that those areas out there, these areas on the high seas, that there's really not many fishing boats out there. But actually, all of these areas are intensively, really industrially fished. In some parts of the world, it's been documented, 99% declines in populations of oceanic white-tip. So, very high levels of fishing pressure in some parts of the world.
What actually happens to the ecosystem as the shark numbers drops? You've talked about the coral, you've talked about the eyes of the fish getting smaller. What are the other impacts on the ecosystem?
Typically what happens, if you imagine one of those typical kind of food pyramids that you might remember from biology, all right, where you've got your kind of large sharks on top, then you've kind of got your, maybe your small sharks, your marlins and things like that, and then maybe you've got small tuna under that. Basically, if you lose the very top level, the top sharks, what they were feeding on will then do a bit better. Let's say in this case, our smaller sharks, our marlin and things like that, maybe their population goes up, but then the next level below them, what they were feeding on, the population will go down. These food webs are very complicated, but what you typically get, you seem to get is basically a kind of ripple effect that runs down through the ecosystem. Because these food webs are so complicated, it's very difficult to predict exactly how they kind of play out. But it does seem that in some cases, the kinds of food, the fishes that we'd like to eat, particular species in particular places, their populations will actually go down. So difficult to predict, but basically a destabilization of the...
Yeah, and that makes sense. You've explained it really well. That makes sense to a non-scientific person. I've got it.
I'm relieved to hear that, Jules.
So, Andy, how can we stop overfishing? What can be done? Do people have to stop eating fish? Do there need to be marketing campaigns? Do there need to be governments making laws? You said that trawling's been banned in Hong Kong. What else can be done?
The number one reason why we have overfishing is because management hasn't taken account of the fact that the sharks, and particularly the large sharks, reproduce slower than the other kinds of things that they're caught with. There are targeted fisheries, but probably most sharks are caught in fisheries that are targeting a wide range of species. So a good example would be tuna fisheries. Out on the high seas, the fishermen are laying these long lines, which may be kilometers long and have thousands and thousands of hooks. And they're primarily targeting tuna, but they know they're going to catch some sharks and they want to catch some sharks. That's part of the economic model. But those fisheries are typically managed for the tuna and they're not well managed for the sharks. So we know what needs to be done. It's fairly basic stuff. I mean, essentially, you need to have limits on the numbers of sharks, and those limits need to be based on the science around the individual species. Even within sharks, I mean, you can't manage all sharks together because some reproduce slowly and are rare, and some, reproduce quite quickly and are common. So it's just really taking account of the fact that sharks are a bit different and trying to have sustainable fisheries for those shark species.
How important is it to not use plastic for the well-being of sea creatures?
Yeah, this is a really emerging topic. I actually met somebody a couple of weeks ago who was looking at the impacts of plastic on manta rays. You would anticipate that those species that are planktivorous, like manta rays, but also like whale sharks and basking sharks would be most affected. And she was saying that her research indicates that for the large particles like plastic bags, the manta ray will actually cough them out, and that kind of makes sense. I mean, maybe other things that are intake that they need to deal with like we do. In terms of the microplastics, she had yet to actually analyze her samples to find, clearly they're finding plastic in the gut of the animals, but the degree to which that's being taken, the plastic is finding its way into the body parts and impacting the health of mantas. This is actually very new topics. I'm sure there'll be a lot more research in the coming years and we'll have a better understanding of that.
Did you see that picture of the whale that washed up and died? There's a picture on social media of a whale with its mouth open and he's full of plastic rubbish. Did you see that image?
I don't think I've seen that particular one.
I wonder if that's real. Is it real? Would a whale die and have mountains of plastic in its stomach?
I know that it's common for those species of whale, again, pseudoplankton, to have, quite substantial amounts of plastic in their stomach. Turtles is a bit different because they think that plastic bags are jellyfish, which is a natural prey. But unfortunately, it's increasingly common that the larger creatures in the sea have substantial amounts of plastic. I'm not sure about the picture that you referred to.
No worries. I meant to ask you earlier about shark finning. Is it illegal in Asia in the waters?
I'm not sure about the regulations of all the countries. I know it's illegal in Malaysia now, and increasingly countries are banning it, probably for inshore fisheries. So, somebody just going out and, rowing themselves out to the edge of the reef, a small little outboard that's not going out too far. They'd probably land the whole shark anyway because it's fresh and there will be some value to the meat, even if it's low. Finning has really been most of an issue on the high seas because you'll get these tuna vessels that will go out and they'll literally fish, 3 months, 6 months before coming back to port. And the shark meat is typically much lower value than the tuna, or at least in the past, they haven't wanted to fill the boat up with cheap shark meat versus expensive tuna.
Yeah.
But of course, the fins don't take up much room in the high value part. A lot of finning, I think, was occurring because people were just drying the fin on the roof of the boat.
Oh, I was going to talk to you about the roof of Shenzhen. Do you remember that time many years ago when there was the roofs of that building in Shenzhen were covered with shark fin?
I remember it well.
Yeah. So does that happen in this day and age still? That was more than 10 years ago, wasn't it?
No, it was much less than that.
Oh, was it?
No, it was,
Oh my God.
It was much less than that.
What happened there? Were you involved with that?
No.
Not with the finning. Did you have anything to do with reporting it or catching culprits or anything like that?
Well, you say culprits, but it's not illegal.
Ah, yeah.
That's completely legal. Just so you get a feeling for what's going on there. So fins are typically imported into Hong Kong, either frozen or dried, because they still have the meat and the skin on them. The processing of shark fins to get the fins and the meat off, it's quite a messy, time-consuming, labor-intensive process. You really have to kind of scrub it all off. So you just get down to the filaments that are used in the soup. So actually, you see that all the time in Shenzhen. Basically, probably what they're doing is that the fins have become a bit humid and probably a bit more stinky than usual. So they're just drying them out in the sun to reduce that moisture level in them. The only thing that was really surprising about that was that there were so many.
So many. Yeah, it was in the news, wasn't it? That's how I saw it.
Yeah, visually, those were very powerful images. But the kind of drying of shark fin in Hong Kong absolutely still continues. It's a common practice. It was just so surprising that there were so many.
I didn't realise it was still legal to do that.
Totally.
Yeah, that's sad. Are there any shark species in the convention or international trade and endangered species of the World Fauna and Flora Register?
Yes. The short name for that United Nations Convention is CITES, and this is the convention set up purely to try to regulate the trade in wildlife products, whether it's animals and plants.
Oh, okay.
That is the convention that says that, for example, that you can't trade internationally in rhino horn or tiger parts or elephant tusks. I'm going to have to get a little bit technical on you, Jules.
Oh, God, I'm bracing myself, Andy.
I'll try and keep this as simple as I can. So,
okay, thanks.
Under that convention, there's basically two main lists. So Appendix 1 is basically no trade. So any species listed on Appendix 1 should be no trade. There are some exceptions like zoos trading animals internationally for zoo collections, but the vast majority of species are actually on Appendix 2. And Appendix 2 is designed to support a sustainable trade. Okay, and the idea is that if a species is listed on that, then a country has to basically do a sustainability assessment to see whether the capture and then take and export of that, any products from that species, one, that it's sustainable, and two, that it's legal. All right. And because just about every country in the world has signed up to CITES, it's a really important convention. And yes, a lot of effort has gone on to encouraging countries to list commercially important species of sharks and rays on that, because they are so threatened by the international trade, particularly in shark fin.
Hey, so have you been to this convention, or are you involved in that at all?
I was involved the last year. So
oh, cool.
Every 3 years, there's the big meeting where all the countries get together. So this is a convention for countries. Different countries will propose species to be listed or even taken off existing lists. And then it requires a 2/3 majority vote by all the countries there and decide whether or not it gets on. There were a number of attempts to list commercially important species of sharks and rays which were resisted, that failed on several occasions.
Why?
Because certain countries felt that fisheries management tools should be used to ensure that the fisheries were sustainable rather than a trade convention. And at the end of the day, this trade convention doesn't mean anything unless the fisheries managers actually make sure that these fisheries are sustainable. So there was a certain logic there, but the point was that fisheries managers had totally failed in most parts of the world to manage their sharks properly. So this was a bit of a, I guess in some ways, a bit of a last-ditch attempt.
Right, so this is like the big boss taking over because they're not doing a good enough job.
Yeah, that's right. So I was present at the last CITES Convention of the Parties, which is the big meeting. I was in Johannesburg at the end of 2016. We'd partnered with many other organizations and some really progressive countries. Fiji, the Maldives, Sri Lanka were there, really supporting the listings of some of these sharks and rays and doing a lot of lobbying, talking to countries over a period of 2 weeks. And then I think it was on the second last day, the countries voted on thresher sharks, silky shark, and the devil rays, and all of them easily got the 2/3 majority. So,
oh, that's cool.
We were certainly celebrating that evening, I can tell you.
That's awesome.
It's an amazing thing to be part of.
Oh, that's really brilliant. Wow, you're really out there making a difference. I'm super proud of you, Andy.
Thanks, Jules. It was a fantastic team effort.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so how can the general public make a difference to conserving the shark population?
It really depends where you are. So, if you live in somewhere like Hong Kong or Singapore or China or places that consume shark fin, not consuming shark fin and encouraging others not to do the same can really make a big difference. Avoid shark meat as well. It's worth sharing that, at this particular point in time, 100% of all the shark fin being sold in this part of the world, it's either unsustainably caught or it's untraceable. All right, so you have no idea if there is any fin from sustainable fisheries, and they have no idea how to distinguish it from everything else, which includes illegally taken. So this is why we are so anti-shark fin consumption. I think also be aware that, if you're on holiday and you see shark teeth being sold and shark leather bags and things like that, while the shark may not have been caught for its teeth or its jaws, you see the jaws being sold as well. If you are buying those products, you are supporting the overfishing of sharks.
And can sharks be fished sustainably?
I guess there's two aspects to that. I was asked a few questions the other day about first whether you could do fish farming, so aquaculture, for sharks. And the answer to that is there are some small sharks where people are actually farming them, for the aquarium trade. But it's just not economically viable to, raise larger sharks for their fins and meat, because to feed them so much meat over, a period of years, and shark meat generally is pretty low value. So it's just not economically viable. In terms of sustainable fisheries for sharks, there is one fantastic example that shows that it's very possible. So there is one Marine Stewardship Council certified fishery off the eastern coast of the United States. And this is for a species which you would never guess that it was possibly to fish sustainably. So this is the 40-year-old virgin of the shark world, all right? Pacific spiny dogfish. It doesn't become sexually mature until it's 40.
What?
Yep, can live till 70 years old. The gestation, once it finally starts reproducing, is 2 years. So very, very slowly reproductive rate. It seems like a hopeless candidate for a sustainable fishery, but the species biology is very well known. It's very well monitored, really looking to see how many young there are. They have very careful science-based catch limits and they enforce them. And the meat from that shark goes primarily to Europe for fish and chips and things like that. So it can be done, but I think we have to be aware that in many parts of the world, that kind of level of science and enforcement is probably not possible. In the developing world, many countries have almost no management whatsoever for shark fisheries. And in those kind of cases, we're talking much more about putting in some levels of management and moving them towards sustainability, but really with the knowledge that sustainability is a long way off.
Andy, I just want to finish with a fun fact of sharks. I did my research and I found 10 fun facts, and I thought this one was really amazing, that the jaws of the extinct megalodon shark measured 6 foot across. 6 foot across, just the jaws. So how big is that shark?
So they reckon that probably it was about 18 meters long.
Wow.
And one of the interesting things with megalodon and other sharks is that, in the fossil record, because they don't have bones, they just have cartilage. Often all you get left is the teeth.
Right.
So what they had to do with megalodon, the teeth of it, and they think megalodon itself was sort of similar to a great white shark. They got the teeth, the largest size of the teeth, taking similar measurements from great white sharks, estimated that based on the size of the tooth, that the total length of the shark was, a certain length. I actually have a megalodon tooth, a real fossil tooth.
Do you?
If we hadn't been doing video today, I would have brought it in to show you.
We could have done a photo for social media, Andy. Oh my God, you've let me down.
Again. Maybe later.
And what's the length of the biggest shark that's alive now?
Biggest shark today is whale shark. There are reports of whale sharks getting to 20 meters long, but there's no good records of that. I think, 12 meters would be considered a large whale shark these days.
That megalodon was probably one of the biggest sharks ever.
It's considered to be the largest shark ever, and it probably used to feed on whales.
Oh my God, really?
Gives you an idea.
And when did it become extinct?
It lived from about 20 million years ago to about 2 million years ago.
Oh my God, you are so coming on my shark trivia team, Andy. You're amazing. Dr. Andy Cornish, thank you so much for meeting me today to talk to me all about sharks and the ecosystem and sustainable fishing and shark finning, and it's been absolutely so fascinating. I've learnt loads and I hope my listeners will love it as well.
Thanks a lot, Jules. It was fun talking to you.
Awesome. Ciao for now. Bye. Hi, Confidants. I want to tell you about my Patreon page. I've joined Patreon in the hope of getting sponsorship for my Hong Kong Confidential podcast. Patreon is a great way for my listeners to get on board and sponsor me with monthly payments, and that goes towards my production costs and rewards for my members. If you're interested in checking out my Patreon page, please go to patreon.com and search up Jules Hannaford or Hong Kong Confidential. I would really appreciate you visiting my page. So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.